Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction module to the Houdini Academy Procedural Asset Production Masterclass. In this video, I want to have a look at how Houdini's node hierarchy and contexts work. Because unlike, say, a program like Max or Maya, Houdini is a completely different beast. And the way how nodes in Houdini work and relate to one another, how they read data from one another and reference each other, is very important. Also, Houdini has different contexts in which we can work, such as the material context, the geometry context, and the rendering context. And we need to understand the difference between those. So in this video, I want to go over that and explore it together with you. So the first thing that I would like to have a look at is Houdini's node hierarchies. And for this, I would like to have a look over here in the network editor. I'm going to expand this a bit and have a look at the operator tree, which we can find over here. We can also press Shift W to open this. And what this does is it opens up this menu, which will show us how all the nodes in Houdini are nested together. At the very top, if I click on this, we can go to the global level, and this will show us all the different types of contexts that we can find inside Houdini. These nodes here, or containers, are the global containers in Houdini, and we can't do anything with these except for go in them and edit nodes inside of them. We cannot rename these, we cannot delete them. In fact, if we try, then Houdini will likely throw you an error from its console. So this is good to know. These are always here and we'll be working inside of them. So with that, we have a basic overview of Houdini's various contexts. And each context in Houdini serves its own purpose. In fact, when you're using Houdini, you probably won't be using all of these at a time. You'll most likely be using only one or two, maybe 3 or 4 different contexts. Unless you're very versatile in Houdini, you won't be using all of them. But that doesn't mean that they aren't useful and that it isn't good to know what they do. In fact, if you dig deep enough, each of these nodes represents a key part of Houdini's systems and are used in a whole lot of different types of purposes. For example, we can use some of them for animation, others for games, and we can even use some of these other ones over here for stage setups and task management. So let's have a quick look at each of them and go over how we could potentially utilize these. So this one here is the channel operator. And the channel operator is used to control animation curves, as well as other things such as MIDI files for their sound waves, for example. And the benefit of that is that we can then use that to drive parameters inside other tools. We could make a tool behave on a sound wave. So we can load in some music and have something bounce to the music, for example. We have a dedicated editor over here under the animation editor. If we were to go inside of the channel operator, we can drop down a dedicated node for one of our animations or sound waves under a shop net. And then in here, we can start loading various types of information. Let's see if we can find an import node, for example, like MIDI in. And this could allow us to load in some music, and this will load it in as a MIDI channel. And this could then be loaded over here inside the animation editor. It's not really the purpose of this video, so I'm going to leave it right here. But it gives you a basic idea of what this could do. Going back up to the top level, the next one over is the image node here, or the Compositing Operator network. And the COPNet allows us to do basic Photoshop-like operations and composite images or renders together. If I go up to the top of my pane here, you can see that we have the composite view. And the composite view allows us to see what's currently inside of our COPNet. Let me go inside of this COPNet, and I'm going to create a new COP network or image network. And then in here, I will drop down a file node. And by default, Houdini likes to load this default picture into this file node. And with this network, we can then do compositing operations such as loading the image, blurring an image, we could crop it, and then we can render it. With this picture selected, I can go over here and drop down a blur node, for example. And if I then plug this in at the bottom of the file node and I click render, now you can see that in the composite view, my picture is actually being blurred. And if I change the value, you can see live, we can actually do some compositing. We can also split channels, such as the different color channels, red, green, blue, and alpha. So we have a lot of options over here, and then we can render it back out to various types of file formats. The next two contexts that I would like to have a look at are the material operator and the shader operator. And these two contexts actually serve pretty much the same purpose, except that the material operator has pretty much phased out the use of the shader operator altogether. The material operator was introduced around Houdini 16 and has since replaced pretty much all the functions of the shader operator. It does things better and can deal with more materials and more variables at the same time. The only reason that the shader operator still exists in Houdini is because of backwards compatibility. Now, if we want to create materials in Houdini, we can do this through the material palette. This is an editor we can add to one of our panels in Houdini. So if I go up top and I can look for it, in this case I need to create it, so I'm going to click on plus. Then I'm going to navigate through the new pane tab type, and down here we can find the material palette. If I click on this, we now have the material net expanded in our screen. Here we can also find our shopnet node as well. Like I said, we probably want to drop our materials up in this part of the editor and not inside the shopnet, so I'm going to compress this one again. Now what I would like to do here is drop down a diffuse shader. So let's have a quick look for that. Now Houdini comes with a lot of different types of shaders, as you can see, and the one I want is a basic diffuse. So I'm going to grab it and I'm going to drop it here into the scene. Houdini also comes with other pre-made shaders, such as say the rock shader. And if we want to find a shader in this list, we can simply type what we're looking for. And here we go. We here have the rock shader filtered out, so I'm going to drop this one in as well. And what this has done is it has basically created two new nodes inside of our modnet over here. If I navigate inside, we can now find a diffuse material builder asset and a principal shader for the rocks. And these are both shaders that we can load on our meshes in Houdini. If I were to look a bit closer at these different assets, you can see that the diffuse shader is actually consisting out of other nodes as well. I can open this up even further and find even more nodes inside of this. And this is basically a pre-assembled shader that allows us to set up a diffuse texture. Now I'm not going to go very deep into this, so let's go back up to the top level and have a quick look at the next context that we can find. The next two contexts that I would like to have a look at are the object container and the surface operator container. Now over here we have the object container. I'm going to grab this and drag it over here to the left. And I'll just quickly close down this drop down a bit so we have everything in view again. The object container represents everything that's currently visible inside of our scene view. In fact, when you have something in your scene or in your world that isn't an abstract thing like a shader or a compositing network, it's probably going to reside inside of an object container somewhere. If I open up this object container, I can then create various different types of elements, such as cameras, lights, and geometry. What I would like to do here is create a geometry network. So I press tab inside the network editor here, and I'm going to drop down a geometry node. And this geometry node creates a new context inside of this object container, specifically for surface operators. And this is where you're basically going to do all your modeling and procedural assembly of mesh-based or geometry-based assets. If I go inside of this geometry container, I enter the SOP context or surface operator context. And the SOP context allows me to place down nodes like I've done in the last video. So let's place down a file node. Let's press tab and type file. And this will load a default file object. Now this default file object is basically an editable mesh. And we can grab its various components and move them around. So let me grab the selection tool and grab one of the sides of this box. And then I can just go ahead and edit it. So this actually added an edit node at the bottom, and the edit node is a very basic Houdini node that records whatever changes I have made to this box ever since it was provided to it, and then feeds it out the bottom part of it. We'll go more over node flows in some of the next videos, but first I would like to demonstrate to you the differences between the SOP operator context and then, if I go back out, to the object context. Because now, if I were to select this box, I can select it, but I can no longer edit it inside of this unless I go back inside of the SOP operator network. I can grab this box and move it around. I can scale it globally, but really what I'm scaling here is the object, not the mesh parts inside. I'm not modifying the various components of this mesh. I'm merely modifying the mesh container itself. So let's go back inside of this network, and I'm going to delete this edit node and leave us with our file node here. So I just have this cube. Next, I would like to have a look at how we can compose a little scene so we can have a closer look at the rendering node or the ROP nodes. So let's grab this geometry container here, this object, and I'm just going to copy this and paste it, create a duplicate, and then I'm going to move it over here to the left. If we press the E, R, or T keys, we can access the move, rotate, and scale controls. Of course, we can also use the handle to get a more context-sensitive rotation, scale, and move control as well. So let's position this box a little bit here, maybe rotate it around so we see one of the different letters on it. There we go. And the next thing I would like to do is place a light and a camera in my scene. So inside the object context here, I can drop other objects than geometry. So I'm going to create a camera. So press tab, type camera, and press enter. And this will create a camera object in my scene that I can then manipulate. If I grab my handle over here, I can then drag my camera around, and the camera actually contains two pieces to its handle editor: a focal point and the camera itself. So let's position this camera in a nice location where I think we could look at both boxes. We can also rotate it using this part of the handle. So you can see that the handles are quite intuitive depending on the object. And next, let's create a light. So if I press tab and I type light, now we've added a light to our scene. And Houdini is pretty smart about itself in that it automatically detected that we now have lights in our scene, and it switched on to normal lighting mode as opposed to headlight mode. Headlight mode is basically the light that comes from your camera, whereas the normal light mode shows you what the lighting will approximately look like. We're still using an OpenGL renderer for our scene here, nothing complicated, so it's still going to look pretty flat, but we can at least have a good idea of what our scene will look like. I'm going to raise the intensity a little bit and just position it about here. So with this little scene set up, the next thing that I would like to do is render this out. So next, let's have a look at the render view. And the render view allows us to have a closer look at the output of the ROP network or the render operator network. In order to view the results, we simply have to open up render view. Now I would like to view both my scene view and my render view at the same time. If I go to any of the tabs up here, over here on the right, we can see we have two more buttons that we haven't yet looked at. These two buttons allow us to manipulate the shape of our current panel and its editors. So the left one allows us to maximize our panel to the full screen. So in this case, I've maximized my viewport. If we click it again, we minimize it and return the screen back to its previous layout. So that's pretty useful. You can also use the hotkey Control B to do the same thing, as long as your mouse is hovering over the panel you want to maximize. We can also do the same thing with the network editor. So hover over that and press Control B, and now we've maximized it. We can also use the arrow on the right of the maximize button to change the shape of the pane itself. So in this case, we can split this panel from left to right. Clicking on this will split it like so, and actually duplicate our current pane tab or editor into the new split pane. I'm going to close this, and this will return it back to how it previously was. We can also use this to tear off a panel or make a copy. So what I would like to do now is go to the render view, click on that, click on the arrow, and then say tear off pane tab. And this will tear off the render view from this set of panels. I'm going to go back to the scene view, and now I have both my render view and my scene view at the same time. With my camera in position, I can now click the render button, and this will start Mantra's rendering system. Now let's have a quick look at the specific dedicated node for Mantra. So if I go inside of the RobNet and click render, you'll see that Houdini has just created a Mantra IPR node. And the Mantra node is basically Houdini's rendering engine that's just been instantiated inside of the ROP or outputs context. And we can see that we now have our boxes inside our render. This was just ray traced using Mantra, and if I change my light position over in my viewport here, let's grab the light, let's move it around, you can see that Mantra in its live form is updating my render view properly. So next, what I would like to do is add some materials to my boxes. Now this render view is getting in my way, so I'm going to minimize it, and this will return it down to the bottom of my screen. If I click on the Houdini tab, I can then reopen it again, and we can get it back. So with it minimized, I'm going to go inside of the geometry node, the geometry container, and under this file node, I'm going to create a material node. So let's press tab and type material. And this allows us to assign a material from one of our existing materials in Houdini's node structure. If I click on this, I can then navigate down to one of the materials that we have inside of our networks. Over here we have the material parameter. If I click on the operator chooser window here, it will open up this drop-down of all the potential nodes in Houdini. Right now our network isn't very complicated, so we only have these options available. And I'm going to select the diffuse node for our texture. We're going to click accept. With this, we've now applied a material to this cube, except the material we're using right now is actually gray, so we won't see a difference. Let's have a quick look and change that. If I go back to my material palette, I can grab the diffuse node, and then I can go over here to the base color, and let's make this red. Back inside my scene view, we can now see that the cube has changed colors. We can still manipulate this as necessary. Another thing you might have noticed is that now that we are actually looking at our cube, all the other elements in our scene have grayed out. This is because up top in the screen, we're actually looking at a ghosted version of other objects. And this is because when we were inside the object network over here, the last object we were rendering was this geometry container. And when you're inside of a geometry container, all the other geometry containers are usually hidden unless they are made visible up top here. So if your objects have actually disappeared and you don't see them, it's because you should turn this on. Or return your camera back to the object level. Next, let's do the same thing with the other geometry node on the right. I'm going to go in here, press tab, type material, and drop it below the file node. Next, let's go to the material parameter, click on the operator chooser, and grab the rocks material, and click accept. We now have our materials properly assigned, and I'm just going to navigate back out to the top of my network here. If I were to go and open up my render view, you can now see that both the cube in red and the cube on the left in its rock material are being rendered. So that's pretty good. So now that we've created our little scene, I want to quickly discuss the last two nodes that we have over here. The first one is called stage, and it relates to Houdini's Solaris system. The stage context is used specifically when you're trying to assemble a scene at a much higher level. It allows you to load in Alembic files, it allows you to set up cameras and lights and manage them. It even allows you to do physics simulations on your objects to make them fall in a natural way. But because this is not the focus of the masterclass, and also requires a little bit more understanding of various parts in Houdini, we're not going to touch this. Likewise, the tasks operators, or topnet, are also a much higher level node that requires a lot of understanding of various parts of Houdini's systems. The tasks operator is basically a way to procedurally set up a task network that you can then run on, say, multiple render machines or a render farm. Now, before I continue, I quickly want to sidestep and discuss one more node context that isn't present here on the top level. And that is the VEX operator, or VEX context. Now, VEX is a scripting language that exists all throughout Houdini and is used by multiple different contexts to deal with math and scripting type equations. If we look at it in the object level here, we can see that I have a VOPnet container inside of it. And if I go inside of this, here we have a selection of VOP nodes that we can drop down inside of our different networks. Here is one specifically for channel VEX operators, called the CHOP VOP. Then we have the COP2 filter and COP2 gen, which are specifically for the compositing context. And then on the right we have the surface VEX operator, or simply called SOP node. If I go inside of these nodes, we can see a different kind of network that equates specifically to the different attributes that we can read from whatever context we're currently in. And this allows us to do things such as do basic math. Now, I won't go too deep into this at this point, but these attributes here reference the various information that we can find on our geometry. The top variable here is the point position of our geometry, so every single vertice on our geometry has a point position, and we can reference this here. And we can then say run it through a multiply, and then multiply this, and then output it again back to the original point position. This allows us to multiply our point positions to, say, scale up our object. If I go outside of the VOPnet, and I look over here to this geometry node, and I go inside, we can see there are different types of nodes in Houdini that are related to scripting. We won't go into Python in this module, but we will definitely cover it in later parts of the masterclass. But we will cover a little bit of VEX over here in this introduction module. And VEX in Houdini, like I mentioned, is a scripting language, but it can be accessed by Houdini through different means. There is the VOPnet that we just looked at, which allows us to grab attributes on the left and assign them on the right. But we can also script it using Houdini's VEX operator language directly in a Wrangle node. We'll discuss all of this later when we are actually doing the introduction assignment and in future modules of the masterclass. But for now, I just wanted to clarify that Houdini's scripting language is available all throughout the program and is very powerful. The next thing I want to have a look at is how Houdini containers work. We've already seen that each of these objects can contain other objects and that they get nested inside one another. However, each of these has changed the context in which we're actually operating. For example, up here the material net actually contains only material nodes, and the object level container contains object level nodes, but it also contains these surface operator containers as well, which, if we dive into that, contain surface operator nodes. So how do we actually manage this? How do we deal with this when we're making tools? Well, let's have a quick look at our little scene here. Let's say I want to make this into a tool. If I grab these nodes, I can actually store them into their own little container called a subnet or subnetwork. I can do that very simply by clicking on this button up here or pressing Shift-C. This is just compress them down into their own little container down here. And all the objects are contained inside that. You can think of it as a package, its own little container subnetwork. And I'm going to give this a name. I'll call this my tool. Now this isn't actually a digital asset just yet. We'll create an actual digital asset in the next videos. But in this one, I just want to demonstrate what happens when we have objects in our scene that are looking at data from one another. For example, our cubes over here are actually searching for data from our material network. And right now, this data is outside of our current tool. And this can cause some issues. Let's go and grab this node and let's drop it in a new session of Houdini. So for that, I'm going to start a new Houdini session. And we can actually copy files between Houdini sessions, which can also be pretty useful. And once that's booted up, I'm going to just quickly grab this and put it over here on my screen. And I can grab this network and drop it inside of my new scene with Ctrl-V. And now you can see that we have our cubes, we have our light, and we have our camera, but we are missing our materials. And that's simply because we didn't actually copy over our materials. If I expand this window for 1 second and pull up my tree view as well, you can see that we have all the objects inside the object context inside this Houdini session, but we are lacking the material files. So how would we go about fixing that? Well, we could actually create a material context inside of this subnetwork in order to store our materials. We don't have to have our materials at the root level material container. We can actually create new material containers, or managers as they're called, in order to create different contexts inside one another. And this is very useful because, as I showed you, if we want to bring our materials along into this new scene file, they have to be inside of our tool. So let's go inside of this subnet representing our tool, and I'm just going to create a modnet. So type tab, I can create a modnet or material network, and this material network actually has created a new material context inside of our object network down here, and we can call this my modnet or my tool modnet. If I dive into this and open up my material palette, you will now see that we actually expanded a new tab down here. So if we want to grab our materials and bring them along, we can grab them over here inside of our original root level material network, inside the editor, copy them, then we can navigate down to our my tool modnet, the one inside of our tool, go inside there and then paste them in here. And now they are present inside of my tool's own network. Let's go back up and return the scene view back to normal. And now we have to assign the materials from MyToolModNet to our cubes. So let's go over there into our geometry nodes, and let's do that really quickly. So if I grab over here on the right the operator changer, I can now go and select from my object dropdown my tool, and then navigate down to MyToolModNet. I could also do a filter and search specifically for MyToolModNet, and it would find that as well. Now what I would like to do is replace my current diffuse with this one. So if I click on that, and now if I were to click accept, it would replace it, but it would replace it with an absolute reference. If I click on that, you now see that the path has changed from -mod to -object -mytool -mytoolmodnet -diffuse. And this basically means that it's now looking for a exact path reference. And this will break if we move this tool into any other context where that path reference doesn't quite work. If we move it into our new scene, let's say we grab our scene over here, and we were to put this inside of its own subnet, and we put that inside of its own subnet, and we expand this, you can see that suddenly that path would no longer work. Because now it would be object /subnet2 /subnet1 /mytool /mytoolmodnet. You know, it gets complicated pretty quickly. So in order to fix that, we need to make a relative reference to make sure this works. If we go over to the object chooser again, we can select the same diffuse node here under MyToolModNet, but instead reference the export relative path option. And what this will do, if I click accept, is it will change the path to a relative one. A relative path operates with ... in order to go up one level in the network. If you do two ... you go up 2 levels. So in this case, this material node here is looking up 1 level into the network, the contents of this geometry folder, and then it's going up another level to my tool, so the second ... and then it's going to navigate to MyToolModNet and then find the diffuse node over there. So that's how the relative reference system works in Houdini. It takes the node that it's originating from, and then it navigates through the network up and back down to the node it's actually looking for, using this language. Let's do the same thing for the other material node, so we can set that one up as well. And I'm going to grab the rocks material, and then select export relative path and click accept. So now that we have this set up, and we can go outside of our little tool environment, everything should now be set up so that if we import this into the other Houdini session, it should now work. So let's quickly do that. I'm going to go back to the other Houdini session, and I'm going to get rid of this old setup we had here. And then I'll plug in our new tool object. And as you can see, now our entire setup has come along. We have my tool. We have inside of that our camera, our 2 geometry objects, the light, and the materials, and everything is properly assigned. If I go to the render view inside this Houdini session and click render, then you will see that everything should be rendering as it was in the other one. So this is the basic idea of tool creation in Houdini, and how you can make sure that your files are inside of the right network and being referenced correctly. So thanks for watching this video. I hope it was informative. I know it was a lot of information. But in the next video, we are going to have a look at how Houdini's nodes relate to one another, how their data flow works, and then we'll be using that to do a little bit of modeling. So we're going to be having a look at surface operators. So I hope to see you in the next video, and thanks for watching this one. Have a good one.